My name is Elena Sinclair. I am 28 years old. For nearly 20 years, my family has called me by my real name, far less often than they've called me the slow one. Not in a joking, affectionate way, but as a cold, persistent label repeated so many times that it seeped into my bones, my memory, and even the way I saw myself. My older sister, Vivian Sinclair, is the pride of the family. Harvard, awards, the right handshakes, the right smiles, photos in the papers. And me, I was the awkward silence at the edge of the frame at family parties and Christmas photos, in conversations where I was always present but never truly included. But on the night my sister was honored at the Plaza Hotel in front of hundreds of people, a stranger walked up to me with a red wax-sealed envelope. And within minutes, the entire story my parents had told about me for years began to crack. What they never knew was that my grandmother had seen everything. She didn't stop them while she was alive. She didn't interrupt family dinners to expose the truth. She didn't shout, didn't cause scenes, didn't cut anyone off. She simply watched, silent, patient. And that silence was the most terrifying thing of all, because while everyone thought she was old, tired, and no longer part of the game, she was the only one who truly remembered every glance, every word, every moment I was pushed away from the table. The Sinclair family is the kind that looks unshakable from the outside. Our name is on hospital wing scholarship funds engraved on brass plaques at art fundraisers. My grandfather laid the foundation, but the one who built it into an empire was my grandmother, Vivienne Sinclair. She started from a small office in Brooklyn in the 60s and slowly turned Sinclair Holdings into a name that made people in Manhattan stand up just a little straighter when they shook your hand. My father, Charles Sinclair, didn't build that empire. He inherited it, but he carried himself as if he were made of concrete, glass, and steel, along with the kind of power that could silence a room. I used to think the worst pain in life was being looked down on by strangers. Later I realized the real pain is when the ones who humiliate you are the very people who were supposed to protect you first. If you've ever been made to feel small by your own family in the very place that was supposed to be your safest space, comment 1. Some pain doesn't need long explanations, just one person who understands. I once believed that the night at the plaza would be the night my family buried me completely beneath my sister's shadow. I was wrong. That was the night the grave they had dug for me began to crack from the inside. I was diagnosed with dyslexia at a young age. When I was 7, after a series of tests, a specialist explained to my parents that my brain processed written language differently. Letters would often switch places, sentences would slip away from meaning, and reading a single page was never the same for me as it was for others. She spoke gently, professionally, and with hope. She said that with early support I could absolutely develop and succeed. My mother, Helena, sat across from her and nodded politely. My father checked his watch twice during the session. On the way home, no one said a word. That night, as I passed by my father's study, I heard him tell my mother, "This isn't something anyone outside the family needs to know. There's no need to turn it into a tragedy." I was too young to understand all the nuances in that sentence, but I was old enough to feel that something had shifted. I wasn't being seen as a child who needed help. I was being seen as a problem that needed to be hidden. Vivian is 4 years older than me. She wasn't beautiful in a soft way. She had the kind of presence that made adults feel like the future was standing right in front of them. She was brilliant, articulate, played the violin, knew exactly how much to smile at a dinner and where to stand in a photograph. Every achievement of hers felt like another brick added to the invisible throne my family had built for her from a very early age. At 12, she studied violin with a teacher who had taught at Juilliard. At 14, she had a private French tutor. At 16, she was preparing for the SAT, with a former Princeton student who charged so much per hour that I still remember the number. I repeated it in my head without even realizing it, $400 an hour. That same year, when I was 12, after months of struggling with reading and being criticized by teachers, I gathered all my courage and asked my mother if I could work with a specialist who supported children with dyslexia. She was arranging flowers on the dining table. She didn't look up right away, and when she did, her voice was so gentle that anyone else might have thought I was a well-cared-for child. Elena, we've already spent a lot on specialists. At some point, we have to accept that not every child is suited for academics. It wasn't encouragement. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't, let me figure something out. It was just a door closing quietly. And I believed her. That's the saddest thing about being a child. When your parents speak with enough certainty, you take their words as the truth about who you are. So I stopped asking. I started learning how to survive on my own. Audiobooks became my first lifeline. I listened while washing dishes, while cleaning my room, while sitting on the train. I drew diagrams, used colors, connected arrows between ideas, built entire visual mazes, just to understand what others could grasp by simply reading a page. I didn't know I was saving myself. I only knew that if I didn't do this, I would drown. In the Sinclair household, there was an unspoken rule. Everyone understood the person mentioned most often was the one who mattered most. Vivian was always mentioned. I was not. Family dinners made that rule painfully clear. My father would usually start with company matters, then move on to Vivian's achievements. My mother would add details that polished the story: what teacher praised her, which professor noticed her, who invited her to a prestigious summer program. And when it came to me, it was often just a short sentence or a vague laugh, or worse, a joke that made everyone at the table laugh while I sat there pretending it didn't matter. I remember one Thanksgiving when the whole family gathered. An uncle asked what book I was reading at school. Before I could answer, Vivian laughed. If she manages to finish one, that would already be a miracle. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. I learned early that humiliation hurts a little less if you pretend to be part of the joke. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that after a while I no longer needed them to say anything. I became the voice in my own head that humiliated me. Every time I was a little slower than others, every time I mispronounced a word, every time I fumbled through a form filled with dense text, I heard my family's voice. You're not good enough. You weren't built for this world. You should know your place. If it weren't for my grandmother, I might have spent my entire life believing I was born just to be the background for someone else's spotlight. Every Sunday, I took the train up to the Upper West Side to visit my grandmother, Vivienne Sinclair. Her apartment was nothing like my parents' house. It didn't try to prove its wealth in every corner. It was quieter, filled with the scent of old books, black tea, and polished wood. The windows looked out over rows of trees. On the walls were black and white photographs from her younger days, standing in front of newly acquired properties wearing a hard hat. Sturdy shoes that weren't pretty but were built to last. In her home, no one asked why I was slow. Instead, I was asked what methods I had come up with to understand things better. That difference meant everything. In one place, my struggles were seen as proof that I was lacking. In the other, they were seen as proof that I was learning how to survive. She never forced me to read out loud to test me. She told stories. She would take old company contracts, spread them across the table, and tell me not to suffocate myself trying to read every line. Look at the whole first, she would say. See the structure. Follow where the money goes. Who controls what? Who benefits if this clause is misunderstood? At first I didn't understand, but gradually I realized she was teaching me a different way of seeing. I couldn't read words as easily as others, but I could see connections faster than most. I could recognize patterns. I could spot inconsistencies. I could sense when something didn't add up, or when someone had intentionally set a trap. One winter afternoon, with snow still clinging to the edges of the window, she placed her hand over mine and said, "You read slower than others, Elena. But you see what they don't. That's not a deficiency. That's a different kind of vision." No one had ever said that to me before. I didn't cry then. I just nodded. But on the train ride home, sitting alone, I stared at my hands for a long time, as if someone had just returned a piece of dignity I hadn't even realized I had lost. She understood my father better than anyone. She didn't speak badly of him. She didn't defend him either. She just said things, short sentences that took me years to fully understand. Your father confuses credentials with value. People who haven't built anything themselves tend to cling the hardest to ownership. Those who make others feel small are often terrified of being seen at their true size. Then one day at the beginning of 2019, she called me over and handed me a small, dark wooden box with brass hinges. It was heavier than it looked. "Keep it safe," she said. "What's inside?" "Not yet." "When will it be?" She looked at me longer than usual. It wasn't the gaze of someone tired or fading. It was the look of someone placing the final piece on a board. "When you truly need it, and when your father shows you exactly who he is." I wanted to ask more, so much more. But she had already moved on to her small balcony garden, the book she was reading, a new kind of tea she had just bought, as if what had just happened was something ordinary. 18 months later, she passed away from pancreatic cancer. I was with her more than anyone else in the family during her final days. Vivian was busy. My father always had meetings that couldn't be moved. My mother visited more regularly but rarely stayed long. I sat by my grandmother's bedside reading to her the passages she loved slowly, carefully. Sometimes she slept and I would just sit there watching her chest rise and fall, trying not to think about what the world would look like without the one person who had ever seen me as whole. The box stayed in my closet for years after that. I thought about opening it many times. But deep down, I think I knew she was right. If I opened it too early, I wouldn't understand. Or worse, I would be so afraid that I'd close it again and never look inside. I didn't know what she was preparing me for. I only knew she had never said anything meaningless to me. And then 5 years after the Christmas dinner where my father turned me into a joke in front of the entire family, everything began to move. After graduating from a public university in New York State in 2022, I applied for a position at Sinclair Holdings. It sounds ridiculous having to apply to a company that carries your own last name, but in my family things have always worked that way. Anything that was supposed to belong to me usually had to take a long indirect path to reach me, if it ever did. I thought about it for a long time before submitting that application. A part of me, still naive, believed that if I got into the company, worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, endured long enough, maybe my father would finally see me differently. Maybe the company could become the place where I proved I wasn't a burden. Maybe I would never be Vivian, but at least I could be useful. My father agreed to hire me. My title, administrative assistant. My salary, $42,000 a year. That same month, Vivian joined the company as a senior legal advisor placed directly on a leadership track. Her starting salary was close to $300,000, not including bonuses and benefits. No one said it out loud, but that gap was the clearest public verdict of how my family saw me. My job consisted of photocopying documents, booking meeting rooms, managing other people's schedules, arranging coffee for people who never remembered my name. Some days I felt like a shadow moving between the printer and the reception desk, from the archives to the pantry, existing mainly to support the momentum of people who mattered more. But in that role where I was considered invisible, I began to see more. I overheard how vice presidents spoke to each other in the hallways. I noticed patterns in which deals were prioritized. I saw who avoided whom, which projects were being unusually funded, which contracts were being rushed through too quickly. During lunch breaks, I would draw diagrams to understand the relationships between funds, subsidiaries, buyers, lawyers, and boards of directors. At first it was just a habit, my way of organizing information visually. But over time, it became a real skill. Once a nearly 100-page document was accidentally sent to me for printing. I couldn't read every line smoothly. But within 15 minutes of scanning the structure, the parties involved, the appendices, and the tracked changes, I realized that a secondary clause had been altered in a way that could shift more legal risk onto the company than intended. I didn't dare report it directly. I simply marked it and passed it along. 2 days later, I overheard one of the company's lawyers complaining that someone had caught the discrepancy before the document was signed. No one asked me. But for the first time, I felt something unfamiliar rise inside me. Not full pride, just a quiet sense that maybe I wasn't as stupid as they had always said. My grandmother once told me that my father read contracts like a lawyer while I read them like an architect. Back then I didn't understand. But inside Sinclair Holdings I began to see what she meant. Some people read documents to win. I read them as systems. If one brick shifts here, how does the wall crack somewhere else? But in that company, ability alone didn't determine where you stood. Bloodline image and the approval of those in power, those were the real elevators. Vivian was invited into strategy meetings I didn't even know existed. Her name started appearing in internal newsletters and congratulatory emails in the proud stories my mother told at fundraising events. Meanwhile, I remained on the lower floors, sometimes walking past glass-walled conference rooms and catching a glimpse of her dressed in expensive business attire, seated among powerful men, as if she had been born to belong there. A part of me was jealous. I won't deny it. But it wasn't the kind of jealousy over clothes or salary. It was something far more painful. I envied the fact that she was assumed to be worthy before she ever had to prove it. While no matter what I did, people always started from the assumption that I was lacking. One evening at a year-end company party, a major investor casually turned to me and asked which department I worked in. Before I could answer, my father cut in. She handles some basic operational tasks. She prefers something simple. He said it lightly, as if he were helping me avoid embarrassment. But I knew it was another cut. He wasn't just describing my job. He was confirming in front of others that I belonged to the lowest level of this house. And it went further than I had imagined. In April 2024, I received an email informing me that my position was being eliminated as part of a company restructuring. The wording was polished corporate language so refined it managed to wrap cruelty in courtesy. I had to read it 3 times before I fully absorbed it. They were firing me. If it had only been about losing my job, maybe the pain would have felt different. I lived in Queens, sharing an apartment with 2 roommates. Rent, living expenses, student loans still hanging over me. Everything was just fragile enough that one email like that could send my life spiraling. I didn't have the financial cushion others in the Sinclair family took for granted. A few months without work, and things could fall apart fast. But what tightened in my chest wasn't just fear of money. It was that familiar feeling. Being discarded. Again. Only this time it came dressed as HR policy. That evening I stayed late at the office. Not because I had work to finish, just because I wasn't ready to go back to my cramped apartment and face the reality that I was about to start over from almost nothing. As I was organizing papers in my cubicle, I heard my parents' voices through the thin wall of my father's corner office. "We can't keep her here when Vivian takes over," my father said. "It looks bad." My mother asked, "Bad how?" "People will wonder why the future CEO has a sister doing such low-level work. They'll ask why she isn't in a better position. Then they'll ask why she's like that." There was a short pause. I pressed my hand against the wall almost without realizing it. My mother replied, her voice soft, the kind she always used when saying the cruelest things. "We've done everything we could, Charles. Some children just don't have what it takes to go far." "Exactly," my father said. "So she has to go. We'll give her a severance package. She should find something that suits her abilities better." Something that suits her abilities better. I don't remember how long I stood there. Only the cold running down my spine as if someone had thrown open a door in the middle of winter. So that was it. In their minds, I wasn't just the failed child. I was a flaw that needed to be removed before Vivian's picture of power could be completed. The next night was Vivian's honor gala at the Plaza Hotel. I knew my father was going to announce something. He wasn't the kind of man who threw lavish events just to offer congratulations. He loved the stage, the timing, the power of having a crowd as witnesses. I thought the worst part would be sitting there watching my sister be celebrated while I had just been pushed out of the company. I was wrong. That afternoon, before leaving the office, I passed by the desk of a senior employee named Patricia Moreno. She had once worked directly with my grandmother. Patricia looked at me for a long moment, longer than politeness required. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." She didn't believe me. Neither did I. But she simply nodded and said something I would remember for a long time. People often mistake silence for weakness. It isn't always. At the time, I didn't know what she meant. That night, I stood in front of the mirror in my rented apartment wearing a simple black dress I had bought on sale at Zara. It wasn't bad, it just made one thing painfully clear. I didn't belong in rooms where people wore the price of a month's rent as if it were nothing. My roommate Maya leaned against the kitchen doorway and said, "If they make you feel small, remember this being small doesn't mean you have less value. Sometimes it just means they're standing on something too fake to see clearly." I gave a faint smile. But deep down, I knew that tonight I would walk into a room where my entire family was already used to seeing me as something optional. If you've ever had to walk into a place knowing you would be underestimated and still held your head high, comment I understand. Some battles begin long before anyone hears the explosion. What I didn't know was that just a few hours later everything would change, not because I was strong enough, but because someone had loved me long enough to prepare that change in advance. The plaza's grand ballroom that night glowed like a dream too expensive for ordinary people to believe in. Crystal chandeliers hung low, casting golden light over ivory tablecloths and tall-stemmed glasses. A quartet played Gershwin in the corner. People laughed, just politely enough clinked glasses at the right rhythm, dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns, as if they had been born into that world. The moment I stepped inside, I felt like an ink stain spilled in the wrong place on a wedding invitation. My mother was the first to stop me. Her eyes moved from my simple makeup to my low heels. She didn't show open disdain, she never did. She had a way of saying things that sounded gentle but made you feel ashamed of simply being there. "Couldn't you find something better?" "This is the best I have." She adjusted her Cartier bracelet and replied evenly, "You'll sit at table 27 near the service entrance. Try not to draw attention." I nodded. What else could I do? She walked a few steps, then turned back slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel personal. "Tonight is about Vivian. Whatever you're thinking or feeling, keep it to yourself. Don't embarrass the family. Don't embarrass the family." I watched her walk away, and almost laughed. It's strange how the people who hurt you the most are always the ones most afraid you'll react. They want to hurt you quietly, want you to carry the wound like it's your moral duty. Table 27 was at the back, partially hidden behind a large column. From there I could still see the stage. I could also see the massive portrait of Vivian in her Harvard gown hanging behind it. The words "Congratulations, Vivian Sinclair" stretched across the room, glittering as if the entire evening had been built to worship one person. The people at my table were distant relatives. Not cruel, just unsure what to say to someone the family had already labeled as less. I was trying not to look at the stage when I noticed a silver-haired man standing near the entrance, alone, not eating, not smiling, not blending in, just watching. And then his gaze settled on me. A chill ran down my spine. At 8:30, the music stopped. The lights dimmed. A spotlight fell on my father standing on stage with a glass of champagne. The room quieted in that particular way it does when power begins to speak. He started with familiar words: tradition, family pride, then Vivian's achievements, top of her Harvard law class, prestigious clerkship, fast track to partnership. Each sentence layered more polish onto her perfect image. Vivian stepped onto the stage in an expensive teal gown, wearing the same smile I had seen my entire life, humble enough to be loved, confident enough to be admired. Then my father said the sentence that made the entire room hold its breath before exploding. "But tonight, I'm not only honoring my eldest daughter's achievements. I'd also like to announce the future of the Sinclair family." I knew. I had known this was coming. Knowing didn't make it hurt any less. Upon my passing, all of my personal assets will be transferred to Vivian Sinclair. This includes the family properties on Park Avenue Investment Holdings, And most importantly, he paused perfectly timed. The position of CEO of Sinclair Holdings when I retire. The room erupted. Applause, standing, laughter, glasses raised, phones lifted, cameras flashing. Vivian embraced my father, her eyes shining, as if holding back emotion in front of hundreds of witnesses. I sat at table 27 behind the column, surrounded by noise, and felt like I had just been erased from my own birth certificate in real time. A relative beside me leaned in and whispered, "So, what does that mean for you?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. What could I say? That just yesterday I had overheard my parents discussing my termination like removing an old piece of furniture, that tonight, in front of 350 people, they had publicly drawn a final line through my place, in this family. Before the applause had even faded, the silver-haired man began walking toward me. Slow, steady, like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He stopped at my table but didn't sit. "Monsieur Sinclair." I looked up. "Yes." "I'm Daniel Mercer." He handed me a card. "Mercer and Hale, your grandmother's attorney." I froze. "My grandmother passed away 3 years ago." "I know," he said calmly. "And she left this for you with very specific instructions about when it should be delivered." From inside his suit, he took out a thick cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax, stamped and notarized. My heart started pounding so hard it almost hurt. "What is this?" "A will," he said. "The original one. The one your father doesn't know exists." The sound in the room faded into something distant, like it no longer belonged to me. My hands trembled as I took the envelope, gripping it tightly just to keep it steady. The notarization date was clear. September 2019. The same year she gave me the box. "I don't understand." "Your grandmother instructed me to deliver it only on the day your father publicly removes you from the family's future." He glanced toward the stage where my father and Vivian were still smiling under the lights. I believe that moment just happened. I couldn't hear the music anymore. Couldn't hear the voices, barely even my own breathing. I just knew I had to get out. I stood up, walked quickly through the service corridor, and found an empty hallway near the kitchen. Then I opened the envelope. And as the first lines came into view, I understood something both terrifying and beautiful at the same time. My grandmother had never abandoned me. She had just been waiting for the right day. The fluorescent lights in the hallway cast a cold white glow over the paper in my hands. The music and laughter from the ballroom were muffled behind the heavy doors, distant like another world. A world that just minutes ago I thought I had been buried outside of forever. I read slowly, very slowly. The words still blurred at times, still shifted under the weight of emotion. But this time I forced myself to keep going. The will was legally signed in 2019, valid, notarized, verified by attorneys. It included a clause revoking all prior versions, and in the middle of the document, my name appeared like a beam of light, cutting through years of darkness. Elena Rose Sinclair is granted 51% controlling shares of Sinclair Holdings, along with full voting rights. I read it again. And again. 51%. Not a consolation prize. Not a small fund meant to take care of the unfortunate granddaughter. Control. I thought that was the biggest shock. It wasn't. The next section forced me to lean against the wall just to stay standing. She had written the reason. She stated clearly that this decision was made with full awareness of how her son had treated me. That I had been excluded, diminished, denied opportunities not because I lacked ability, but because I lacked fair support. That I wasn't slow. I had been abandoned. I don't remember when I started crying. Maybe at the word abandoned. Because for the first time in my life, someone with authority in this family had named the truth exactly as it was. No sugarcoating, no justification, no disguising it as protection or realism or what's best for you. Just the truth. They had abandoned me. Then I saw the condition. I had 72 hours from the moment I received the will to call an emergency board meeting. If I failed to act within that window, the will would become void and everything would revert to the previous version. I could barely breathe. She hadn't just left me power. She forced me to decide whether I was brave enough to take it. When I returned toward the coat check area, Daniel Mercer was still there, as if he had known exactly what my face would look like when I came back. You've read it. Why 72 hours? He studied me for a moment before answering. Because she understood you. If she gave you too much time, you would start doubting yourself. Then you'd convince yourself that silence is safer. I tightened my grip on the papers. Did she know this would happen? Not every detail, he said, but she understood her son, and she understood that this family runs on exclusion disguised as politeness. She was waiting for the moment it became so public that no one could deny it anymore. I glanced through the ballroom doors. My father was still smiling among the guests. My mother moved between tables like the hostess of a victory. Vivian stood under the lights, perfect, radiant living proof that the family had chosen the right daughter. If I acted, there would be no going back. My parents would never forgive me. Vivian would call it betrayal. They would say I was greedy, unstable, manipulated, acting out of emotional damage. They would rewrite the story just like they always had. But if I didn't act, I would be signing my name onto the version of myself they had written since I was a child. Daniel spoke again quietly but sharply. Your grandmother spent the last 3 years of her life preparing for this moment. The question is no longer whether she believed in you. The question is, do you believe in yourself? That night back in my apartment in Queens, I took the wooden box out of my closet. I placed it on the bed and sat across from it for a long time. Then I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, an older document dated 1965 and a USB drive. I read the letter first. She apologized for not protecting me while she was alive, but she said she could do it now. She left me the original founding document of the company containing clauses that protected the voting power of the founding shareholder. She also left evidence that my father had once tried to reduce her voting control while she was still alive. Not for revenge, she wrote, but so justice has something to stand on besides tears. I plugged the USB into my laptop. The first file was a board meeting record from 2018. The second was an audio recording. My father's voice filled the room, cold, precise, pragmatic. He proposed reducing his own mother's control from 51% to 10%, claiming she was no longer keeping up with the modern business environment. I sat frozen. Everything clicked into place. My father wasn't just someone who underestimated me. He was someone who feared anyone who could truly see through him, even his own mother. And then, it went further than I had imagined. The next morning, I called Margaret Rowan, a longtime board member and an old friend of my grandmother. Her voice over the phone was slightly rough but sharp. I was wondering when you'd call. You knew. Your grandmother told me 3 years ago. Not everything. Just that if you ever called, it meant Charles had finally done exactly what she feared. I closed my eyes. I want to call an emergency meeting. Then prepare yourself, she said, her tone shifting instantly into that of a woman who had spent her life in rooms of power. This won't be pretty. A pause. But pretty isn't the goal. Margaret Rowan didn't offer comforting words. That was exactly what I respected about her. She didn't treat me like a pitiful girl who had just discovered her family's betrayal. She treated me like someone about to walk into a battle that required a clear, steady mind. She explained it simply: to call an emergency board meeting, I needed at least 2 additional board members to co-sign the request. She was the first. The other two would most likely be Edward Holloway and Susan Parker, both of whom had clashed with my father in closed-door meetings before. "Why would they help me?" I asked. "They're not helping you," Margaret replied. "They've been waiting for someone brave enough to open the door. You just happen to be the one holding the key." That entire day, I moved through the office as usual while living with a completely different heartbeat. I printed documents, replied to emails, scheduled meetings, but beneath every familiar motion there was a current of tension running through me. That afternoon Vivian called. Her voice was sharp like shattered glass. "What did you do? What are you talking about?" "Don't pretend," she almost hissed into the phone. "Father just received notice of an emergency board meeting. Margaret Rowan hasn't done that in over 10 years. What did you do?" I spun a pen between my fingers to hide the trembling. Maybe she has concerns about the company. "Don't play dumb with me, Elena." I stayed silent for a few seconds, then said softly, "I'm just doing my job." She hung up without another word. 20 minutes later, my father walked past my cubicle, moving quickly, his expression so cold the entire row of desks fell silent. He didn't look at me, but when he slammed his office door, the glass trembled. A while later, through the wall, I caught fragments of his voice on the phone. "A waste of time. Margaret's probably just stirring trouble again in her old age. That girl, please. She can't even read a spreadsheet properly. She's not a threat to anyone." He sat still. Then very slowly I smiled. For the first time in my life, being underestimated didn't feel like a sentence hanging over my neck. It became a cover. That night at home, I spread everything out across my bed. The will, the original charter copy, meeting records, the audio recording, notes I had written to keep myself from getting lost in emotion when speaking before the board. Daniel Mercer confirmed he would be there to validate the legality of the documents. Close to midnight, Margaret texted, "Request submitted. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., floor 42. I barely slept. But not the old kind of sleeplessness, the one filled with shame and quiet despair. This was different. This was the sleeplessness of someone standing in front of a door they had never been allowed to touch. The next morning, I wore a gray blazer borrowed from Maya. It was 2 sizes too big, the shoulders slightly off, but when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the girl from table 27 anymore. I was still afraid. Still shaking. Still aware that everything could collapse if I made one wrong move. But this time, inside that fear, there was something new. His Alvi. The Sinclair Holdings building stood cold and sharp under the Manhattan morning light. The 42nd floor had always made me feel smaller, the marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling glass, the minimal design that whispered wealth in the most expensive way possible. Security stopped me at the meeting room door. "Name?" "Elena Sinclair." He checked his tablet and frowned. "You're not on the approved list." "I have business with the board." "I'm sorry, I can't." "What seems to be the problem?" Vivian's voice came from behind me. I turned. She was wearing a dark blue suit, a Hermes silk scarf, her hair perfectly styled. She didn't need to say she belonged here. Her entire presence said it for her. "Elena," she smirked. "What are you doing up here?" "I have information to present to the board." "About what?" She laughed lightly. "You work in copy services." I looked straight at her. "Confidential matters." Her smile thinned. At that moment, my father appeared at the end of the hallway with 2 senior executives. He looked at me like I was a stain on glass. "Go back to your desk. This doesn't concern you." "It does." An older woman's voice cut through the tension. Margaret Rowan stepped out of the meeting room, silver hair, straight posture, calm eyes that carried quiet authority. I invited her. My father's jaw tightened. "Margaret?" Let her in. It was a small moment. But to me it felt like the first time in my life someone opened a door, instead of closing it in my face. I stepped inside and understood one thing clearly. From this point on, either I would be completely crushed, or I would never be that girl again. The boardroom wasn't as large as I had imagined, but the power inside it felt compressed, dense, and heavy. An oval walnut table, black leather chairs, a decorative fireplace, portraits of past leaders lining the walls. At the center, my grandmother's portrait. Her gaze wasn't soft. It was the same as when she was alive, sharp, direct, as if she could see through what others tried to hide. I was directed to a seat at the far end of the table, the position furthest from the center. It was almost ironic. Even in a meeting that could reshape the entire power structure of the company, I was still placed at the edge. Daniel Mercer sat in the corner with his black leather briefcase. He gave me a slight nod. Margaret sat upright to the left of the board chairman. Edward Holloway and Susan Parker were both present. My father sat at the head of the table. Vivian sat to his right, though not officially a board member, already occupying the seat of an heir. The chairman, Robert Ellison, began the meeting. His voice was low, steady, carrying the quiet fatigue of a man who had spent a lifetime mediating strong egos. This emergency meeting has been called at the request of Margaret Rowan, Edward Holloway, and Susan Parker. Miss Rowan, would you like to make an opening statement? Margaret stood. Briefly. A new document has surfaced. It directly impacts the ownership structure of Sinclair Holdings. She turned to me. I yield the floor to Miss Elena Sinclair. All eyes shifted toward me. My heart pounded so hard I thought they could see it through my blazer. But strangely, my hands were steady. I stood and opened my folder. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. What I'm about to present may come as a surprise. I only ask one thing: please look at the evidence before drawing conclusions. Before I could continue, my father raised his hand. Robert, before we waste the board's time... He stood buttoning his jacket with a calm, almost patronizing composure. I think I should provide context. Elena is my daughter. I love her, but she does not have the expertise to present any serious business matter here. I said nothing. He continued, his tone polite in a way that made it colder. She works in administration. She has no legal background, no strategic experience, no financial training. Vivian added softly, her voice like velvet. Elena also struggles with reading comprehension due to dyslexia. Our family has supported her for years, but there are limits that effort alone cannot overcome. A few board members shifted slightly. No one spoke, but the atmosphere changed. I recognized the strategy. Don't attack the evidence first. Destroy the credibility of the person presenting it. My father concluded, I'm afraid this is simply an emotional reaction after last night's gala. Sibling rivalry can sometimes... Mr. Sinclair. Robert Ellison cut him off. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. You will have your opportunity to respond. For now, Miss Sinclair has the floor. My father sat down, his eyes fixed on me, a warning. Vivian's lips moved silently. I could read them. You're embarrassing yourself. I looked at both of them. And something strange happened. Not anger, not an emotional surge, but clarity. Cold, precise, detached. For the first time, I saw exactly what they were doing. They weren't protecting the company. They weren't protecting the family. They were protecting a story, the one where I was never meant to stand beside them. I reached into my folder and pulled out the first document. I'm not here today to discuss my reading ability. I held up the paper. I'm here to present the final will of Vivienne Sinclair, founder of Sinclair Holdings. The room fell silent. I don't know whose expression I'll remember more in that moment, my father's or Vivian's. Both looked like they had just seen a door they thought was permanently locked swing open. That's impossible, my father snapped. For the first time his voice slipped. My mother's will was established in 2015. I have a copy. You have the previous version. I placed the document in front of Robert Ellison. Under New York inheritance law, a later valid will revokes all prior versions. I turned to Daniel Mercer. Mr. Mercer, please confirm the authenticity of this document. Daniel stood and stepped forward with the calm of a man who had spent decades in rooms where truth arrives late but lands heavily. I am Daniel Mercer, partner at Mercer & Hale, and personal attorney to Miss Vivienne Sinclair from 2008 until her passing. I confirm this document was lawfully executed, signed in my presence, notarized and stored according to standard legal procedure. Robert lowered his gaze to read. His eyes paused at one section. Then he looked up at me. This will transfers 51% of the company shares to you. Yes. A quiet ripple of breath moved through the room. Vivian spoke immediately. Forgery. Be careful with that word, Miss Sinclair, Daniel said calmly, his tone sharp, especially without evidence. My father slammed his hand on the table. My mother was not of sound mind at the time. I took out my phone and placed it in front of me. Then perhaps you'd like to explain this next piece of evidence. I pressed play. My father's voice from 2018 filled the room, clear, cold, unmistakable, proposing to reduce his own mother's voting power because she was no longer capable of keeping up with modern business operations. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. Even the hum of the air conditioning felt loud. My father's face flushed red. That was an internal discussion. And she had every right to record it as the controlling shareholder, I replied. Robert removed his glasses and set them on the table. Miss Sinclair, please read the relevant section of the will into the record. I picked up the document. My throat was dry. But my voice did not break. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't reading out loud to prove that I wasn't stupid. I was reading to return the truth of who I am to a room full of people who had never truly known me. I leave 51% of Sinclair Holdings along with full voting rights to my granddaughter Elena Rose Sinclair. I paused for a brief moment, then continued reading the part that seemed to pull the entire room deeper into silence. This decision is made with full awareness of how my son Charles Sinclair has treated Elena. She has been excluded, diminished, and denied opportunities not because she lacks ability, but because she was not treated fairly. Elena is not slow. Elena was abandoned. I heard Vivian inhale sharply, but I kept going. Charles has confused credentials with character and achievement with worth. He once attempted to strip me of my authority because he believed I was no longer capable of standing in his way. He diminished Elena because she reminds him of the part of himself he cannot control through status. I lowered the paper. My father didn't look at me. He looked at my grandmother's portrait on the wall as if by avoiding my eyes he could still hold on to what little control he had left. Robert turned to Daniel. Legally valid. Completely. Then as of this moment, Robert said slowly, each word precise, Elena Sinclair is the controlling shareholder of Sinclair Holdings. For years I had imagined that if a moment like this ever came, I would feel victorious. But the first emotion that hit me wasn't triumph. It was something closer to shock, almost painful. Because the power now in my hands wasn't just wealth. It was proof that my family had been lying about me my entire life. Vivian tried to regain her composure. Even if the will is valid, Elena has no experience running a company. She cannot manage Sinclair Holdings. I lifted my head. I'm not asking to run the company. The room turned toward me. I'm asking the board to look at the truth and to act according to the governance principles this company claims to uphold. I pulled out the 2018 meeting record. On the 14th of March 2018, Charles Sinclair proposed reducing Vivienne Sinclair's voting power from 51% to 10%, claiming she was no longer capable of understanding modern business operations. The proposal was rejected by two decisive votes, Vivienne Sinclair herself and Margaret Rowan. Margaret nodded. That's correct. Which means I continued turning to the board. My grandmother was fully lucid when she recognized what her son was trying to do. And when she created this new will in 2019, she was not being manipulated. She was defending herself from her own son. Charles finally spoke, but his tone had changed. No longer the voice of a superior father, now it was the voice of a man trying to salvage what remained of his position. This is all being twisted. Then do you have any evidence to refute it? I asked. Silence. Robert looked around the table. Does anyone have evidence contradicting the documents presented? Nothing. That silence was the moment the board flipped. After a brief recess for legal verification, the board returned with its formal conclusion: the will was valid, fully enforceable, and control of the company was now mine. Then Robert turned to me. Miss Sinclair, as the controlling shareholder, do you have any proposal for the board? This was the moment people would later ask me about. Why didn't I stand up and fire my father immediately? Why didn't I return every humiliation he had ever given me? Why didn't I use my power to crush him, the way he had tried to crush me? The truth is, for a few seconds I imagined it. I imagined him being removed from the very room he had once used to exclude me. I imagined Vivienne's face as the future she had been promised collapsed in front of her. I imagined the satisfaction of repaying 20 years of being made to feel worthless. But then I looked at my grandmother's portrait. And I knew. If I acted only out of pain, I would become another version of the very thing that had hurt me. I have a proposal, I said. My father looked up. I do not propose removing Charles Sinclair immediately. A few people in the room shifted. Vivienne almost stood up. Even Margaret looked at me differently. What I propose, I continued, is a vote of confidence. The board will decide whether Charles Sinclair still holds the trust required to remain CEO. If the majority votes no confidence, he resigns according to company bylaws. If the majority supports him, I will not interfere with current operations. Vivienne stood abruptly. This is revenge disguised as procedure. No. I met her eyes. This is corporate governance. You studied law at Harvard. You should recognize that. Robert studied me for a long moment. Something close to respect flickered across his face. Is there a seconder for this proposal? Yes, Margaret said immediately. I support it. The vote began. Votes in favor of confidence in Charles 4. Votes of no confidence 7. 1 abstention. Robert counted again, then spoke the sentence that would change not only the company, but the story my father had told about himself for years. The motion passes. Under Article 14.3, Charles Sinclair has 30 days to submit his resignation. No one cheered. No applause. No celebration. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was colder than that. Cleaner than that. A verdict that didn't need volume because the evidence had already done the heavy work. My father stood. He looked at me. For the first time in my life, he truly saw me. Not through the filter of judgment, not as something to hide, not as the lesser daughter standing behind her sister. He looked at me as someone capable of taking everything from him. And in his eyes, for the first time, I saw fear. If you've ever waited for the truth to finally speak for you, comment enough. Some victories are quiet, but powerful enough to change how an entire room sees you. My father left the room without another word. Vivienne stood frozen. And I finally understood. Justice doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives like a door opening in silence and lets everyone see exactly how they've treated you. As the boardroom gradually emptied, the adrenaline began to drain from my body, and only when it did I realized how exhausted I truly was. Not physically. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes after holding a door shut for too long, and finally letting go. My parents stopped me in the private hallway near the elevators. I didn't know when my mother had arrived. Someone must have called her during the board's recess. Her mascara was slightly smudged. My father looked pale in a way that suggested he had never truly prepared for the possibility of losing. "You've just destroyed this family," he said. I looked at him for a moment. Strangely, I wasn't shaking anymore. "No," I replied. "I told the truth." The truth. He let out a dry laugh, his voice heavier, more venomous. "You used a sick old woman, some lawyer, and a few papers to steal something that was never yours." "Nothing about this is theft," I said. "She wrote that will after you tried to take her power." My mother stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Elena, you have to understand. We were trying to protect you. You've always struggled. We didn't want to put pressure on you that you couldn't handle." I don't know where the strength came from, but once I started, everything poured out like water held too long behind a dam. "Protect me. Every dinner you talked about Vivian like she was the future, and I was an embarrassing footnote. Every holiday, every family gathering, every time someone asked about me, you made me smaller. When I asked for help at 12, you told me some children just aren't meant for academics. When I joined the company, Dad put me at the lowest position and used that position to prove I had no value. That's not protection. That's erasure." My mother started crying. My father clenched his jaw. "This isn't over." "I know," I said, "but this time I'm not afraid." He grabbed my arm out of instinct, as if his body still remembered controlling me better than his mind did. I pulled away. "I'll sue you." "Go ahead." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Because we both knew my grandmother had prepared too carefully for this to collapse under anger alone. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed in front of them. And as the elevator began to descend, I leaned back against the cold steel wall and finally let myself breathe. I thought I would feel victorious. But the first thing that rose inside me was grief. Not because I regretted what I had done, but because I realized something painfully clear. The hope that one day my parents would truly see me, love me the way they loved Vivian, had died in that room. And I was the one who buried it. Some illusions, even when they hurt us, are hard to let go of, because as long as we hold on to them, we can still believe that maybe tomorrow will be different. That day I lost that imagined tomorrow. When I reached the lobby, Daniel Mercer was waiting near the security desk. "You did well." "I did what needed to be done." "Your grandmother would agree." We walked outside together. The Manhattan sunlight reflected sharply off the glass building. I looked up at the name Sinclair at the top of the tower, and for the first time it felt unfamiliar. That name had always made me feel like I both belonged, and never truly did. Now I had legal power within it. But strangely, for the first time, I no longer needed it to tell me who I was. The next day, Robert Ellison sent an email confirming my father would step down in 30 days. The board invited me to take on a strategic advisory role during the transition. I read the email 3 times. Old habits. Then I sent it to Daniel to review. He replied quickly. Fair. No traps. A company-wide email went out that evening. Charles Sinclair stepping down, Robert assuming interim leadership. Elena Sinclair welcomed as strategic advisor and controlling shareholder. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. People who had once forgotten my name suddenly wanted coffee to catch up to connect. I didn't answer most of them. I didn't resent them the way I resented my parents. They were just a byproduct of the old power structure acting the way people often do when someone invisible suddenly becomes important. Among all the messages, one from Patricia Moreno made me pause. Your grandmother once said you see what others overlook. Today I finally understand what she meant. Welcome to the room you should have been in all along. I saved that message. Because sometimes the recognition that matters most doesn't come from family. It comes from people who don't owe you love, but are honest enough to see your worth anyway. A week later, the story began leaking through Manhattan's real estate circles. No one needed the press to name names. Everyone in the industry could piece together what had happened. The whispers spread faster than I expected. Some longtime partners requested private meetings with me. Two of them openly admitted they had been concerned about my father's leadership style for years. They just hadn't had a strong enough reason to act. What surprised me wasn't that people supported me. It was how many had seen the problem all along and stayed silent. 3 weeks after the board meeting, my mother called. Her voice was quieter, as if she had just walked through a storm she hadn't expected. She wanted to meet me alone. We met at a neutral cafe in Midtown. Not her house, not the office, not anywhere tied to the old structure. She apologized. Not perfectly, not beautifully, not enough to erase 20 years. But it was the first apology that wasn't wrapped in excuses. I asked her, "Are you sorry because you're hurting, or because everything has changed?" She was silent for a long time before answering. Both. It hurt. But I respected that truth more than any polished lie she had ever given me. I didn't forgive her right away. I didn't cut her off either. I just told her that if anything was going to be rebuilt, it had to start with truth, not forgetting. 2 months later, Vivian called. We sat on a bench near Bethesda Fountain, the summer heat pressing down on the water. She looked different, less polished, less untouchable. She told me she had started therapy after the board meeting. She said being the golden child wasn't the gift people imagined. It was another kind of cage. Shinier. But still a cage. I listened. Not to forgive immediately. Just to understand for the first time that in a broken family the favored child isn't always the healthiest one. Just the one rewarded for playing the role longer. We didn't become the kind of sisters you see in happy family ads. But we started telling each other the truth. And compared to the past, that alone felt like a small miracle. 6 months later, I moved into my own apartment in Brooklyn Heights. 1 bedroom, an old building. From the window, I could see the bridge my grandmother once crossed in the early days of building the company. I took on the role of Director of Sustainable Development at Sinclair Holdings, a position I proposed myself. A division focused on green projects, responsible redevelopment, long-term impact, instead of chasing short-term numbers that only looked good on paper. The salary was better. The dividends from my shares meant I no longer lived in fear that a single email could collapse my life. But the biggest change wasn't money. For the first time in my life, I no longer measured my worth through my parents' eyes. My father calls me once a month now. Short conversations, polite, controlled. He asks about the weather, my work, my apartment. We haven't touched the ruins of the past yet. Maybe he isn't ready. Maybe I no longer need to pull him into that place just to prove anything. On the wall of my living room hangs my grandmother's portrait, the same one that used to be in the boardroom. Some evenings when the sunset touches the frame, I feel like she's looking at me the way she always did. No drama. No pity. Just quiet, steady belief. Looking back, I understand now. She didn't leave me 51% of the company because I was better than Vivian. She left it to me because I understood what it felt like to be excluded. People who have been pushed out tend to value the door more. And people who have been made to feel small tend to be more careful when they hold the power to hurt others. Dyslexia is no longer a shadow I need to hide from. It's part of how I see the world. It slows me down in some ways. But it also gives me the ability to see structures others miss. What my parents called a flaw turned out to be part of the very strength that helped me survive, understand, and walk into that room without collapsing. Charles Sinclair measures people by credentials, achievements, and how acceptable they look to society. Vivian Sinclair measured by character kindness and how someone treats those with less power. And me? I finally learned to measure myself by something entirely different. I didn't get a perfect family after all this. Not every wound disappeared. Justice doesn't heal your heart overnight. But I gained something I never had as a child. The right to define my own worth. And that was the greatest inheritance of all. If you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or labeled in a way that made you feel small, remember this. You don't need a secret will to prove your value. But at some point you do have to give yourself permission to stop asking for recognition from people who were never willing to give it honestly. Boundaries aren't cold walls. They are doors. They give you the power to decide who enters your life, how far they come in, and under what conditions. My family hurt me for nearly 30 years. But I didn't need to hurt them back to find peace. I just needed to stop standing in front of them like a child waiting to be chosen. I'm not waiting anymore. And from that day on, for the first time in my life, I truly belong to myself.